The invisible audience. You ever replay a conversation over and over, long after it's already over, not because it mattered that much, but because of how you think you came across? That moment where you paused too long, that sentence that didn't land right, that look on their face you can't quite read. So your mind starts working, reconstructing, editing, rewriting what you should have said. And here's the part you don't notice. You're not reliving the moment. You're performing it for an audience that isn't even there anymore. This is how it starts. Small, almost invisible. You walk into a room and adjust your tone slightly. You hold back a thought because you're not sure how it'll land. You say yes when your instinct said no, just to avoid friction. Nothing dramatic, but it adds up, because you're not just acting. You're calculating, constantly. How am I coming across? Did that sound right? Do they think I'm confident or awkward? And the more you do it, the more your attention leaves you and gets placed somewhere else. On them, their reactions, their opinions, their approval, until one day, something uncomfortable hits you. You're not living your life. You're managing how it's perceived. Every move filtered, every word adjusted, every moment slightly edited. And the strange part is, it doesn't feel fake. It feels responsible. Like you're just being aware. Like you're just being socially intelligent. But there's a fine line between awareness and anxiety, wearing a mask. And most people have been living on the wrong side of that line for years. Quietly performing, quietly adjusting, quietly asking the same question over and over again. How am I being seen right now? But here's the truth that changes everything. The audience you're performing for isn't watching you the way you think, because they're too busy performing for their own. And once you really see that, the entire game starts to fall apart. You're living for an audience that doesn't exist. Here's the uncomfortable realization. You're not just aware of people. You're living for them, not consciously, but in small, constant adjustments that shape how you move, speak, and even think. You don't just say what you mean. You say what will be received well. You don't just act. You calculate. How will this sound? How will this look? How will they interpret this? And over time, that calculation becomes automatic. So automatic that you don't even question it anymore. You call it being thoughtful. You call it reading the room. You call it social awareness. But look closer. There's tension in it. A quiet pressure. Because every decision has a second layer. Not just what do I want to do, but how will this be perceived? And that second question is what pulls you out of yourself. You start filtering your words mid-sentence, second-guessing your tone, rewriting your thoughts before they're even expressed. And the more you do it, the further you move away from something simple, clarity. You don't feel direct anymore. You feel managed, edited, careful, because you're trying to satisfy something that can never be fully satisfied. Other people's perception. And here's the part most people never stop to consider. That audience in your head isn't real. It's a projection, a mix of past experiences, fears, and assumptions about what people might think. You're reacting to imagined judgments, trying to meet expectations that were never clearly stated. And because of that, you're constantly adjusting yourself to fit a standard that keeps changing. This is the trap. You give your energy to being understood instead of understanding yourself. You focus on how you're seen instead of what's actually true. And slowly, without realizing it, you stop being grounded in your own perspective. You become dependent on feedback, on reactions, on signals from the outside world, to tell you if you're doing it right. But the more you rely on that, the more unstable you become. Because now, your sense of self is tied to something you can't control. And that's where the real problem begins. When awareness turns into anxiety, at some point, what you call awareness stops being a strength and starts becoming a burden. Because you're not just aware of what's happening, you're aware of how it might be interpreted. Every word gets checked twice. Every reaction gets monitored. Every silence gets analyzed. You notice everything. The tone shift, the pause, the subtle change in someone's expression, and instead of letting it pass, your mind grabs it. What did that mean? Did I say something wrong? Are they thinking differently about me now? It feels like awareness, but it's not. It's anxiety disguised as control. Because real awareness keeps you present. This kind of awareness pulls you out of the moment. You're no longer in the conversation. You're observing yourself inside the conversation, watching your words, judging your delivery, trying to correct yourself in real time. And the more you do that, the less natural you become. You hesitate where you used to be fluid. You overthink where you used to respond. You hold back where you used to speak freely. Not because you don't know what to say, because you're afraid of how it will land. This is the hidden cost. You trade authenticity for approval, clarity for control, presence for performance. And over time, something subtle starts to happen. You stop trusting your instincts. That first thought, the honest one, the real one, gets filtered out, replaced by something safer, more acceptable, more polished, but less you. And the worst part, you don't feel confident doing it. You feel tense, because no matter how much you adjust, you can never fully control how people perceive you. So your mind keeps working, constantly scanning, constantly correcting, constantly trying to stay ahead of judgment. And that's exhausting, not physically, mentally, because you're running a background process all day that never turns off. This is where most people get stuck. They think they need to be more confident, more charismatic, more socially skilled. But that's not what's missing. What's missing is freedom. Freedom from the need to manage how you're seen. Because until you have that, you're not really showing up. You're performing. And performance always comes at a cost. The truth, nobody is watching you. Here's the truth that feels almost uncomfortable at first. No one is paying as much attention to you as you are. That moment you've been replaying for hours, they forgot it. That sentence you keep analyzing, they barely registered it. That look you're trying to decode, it probably had nothing to do with you, because while you're busy thinking about how you came across, they're doing the exact same thing. Replaying their own words, questioning their own behavior, managing their own image. Everyone is caught in their own head, running their own internal performance, worrying about their own version of the audience. And that changes everything, because it means something simple. You've been adjusting yourself for people who aren't even focused on you. Think about how much energy that takes. All the filtering, all the second guessing, all the mental effort to appear a certain way. And it's based on a false assumption that you're being constantly evaluated. But you're not. Not the way you think. People are too busy dealing with themselves. Too distracted. Too consumed. Too caught up in their own thoughts. And once you really understand that, something releases. You don't need to manage every word. You don't need to control every impression. You don't need to be perfectly understood. Because the pressure was never real. It was self-created, built from assumptions, not reality. This doesn't mean people don't notice anything. They do, but not in the obsessive, hyper-detailed way your mind imagines. They notice patterns, consistency, energy, not the tiny imperfections you keep focusing on. So the moment you stop treating every interaction like a performance, you start to relax. Your thoughts slow down. Your presence comes back. Your words feel natural again. And instead of trying to control how you're seen, you start focusing on something far more important, being clear with yourself. Because when you're grounded in that, you don't need an audience. You don't need approval. You just show up. And that's when people start seeing you differently, without you trying to control it at all. Building an internal foundation. Once you see the illusion, you have a choice. You can keep living through other people's eyes, or you can start building something most people never develop, an internal foundation. Because if your sense of self depends on how you're perceived, you will never feel stable. One compliment, you feel high. One criticism, you drop. One good interaction, confidence. One awkward moment, doubt. Up and down, back and forth. Not because you're weak, but because your center is outside of you. The Stoics refused to live that way. They understood something most people avoid. If you don't decide who you are, the world will do it for you. Marcus Aurelius didn't wake up asking, "How will people see me today?" he asked. "What kind of person will I be, regardless of what happens?" That's the shift, from perception to principle. Instead of reacting to how you're seen, you define how you act. Clear standards, clear values, clear direction, not based on approval, based on alignment. You don't speak because it will sound good. You speak because it's true. You don't hold back because it might be judged. You act because it matches who you are. And here's what happens when you start doing that. The noise quiets down because you're no longer checking yourself against everyone else. You already know where you stand. You don't need constant feedback. You don't need reassurance. You don't need to monitor every reaction in the room because your reference point is internal. And that changes the way you move. You become more direct, more grounded, more consistent. Not because you're trying to impress anyone, but because you're no longer trying to adjust for them. This is where real confidence begins. Not in how you present yourself, but in how little you need to manage that presentation. And once that foundation is in place, you stop performing. You start living on your terms. What real confidence actually looks like. Most people misunderstand confidence. They think it's about being louder, more expressive, more impressive. They think it looks like dominance, like quick responses, like always having the right thing to say. But that's not confidence. That's performance, with better execution. Real confidence is quieter than that. It's not built on how you come across. It's built on how little you need to think about it. A confident person isn't constantly checking themselves mid-sentence. They're not scanning the room for approval. They're not adjusting their personality depending on who they're around. They're just consistent. The same tone, the same presence, the same level of clarity, whether they're being praised or ignored, agreed with or challenged, because their stability doesn't come from the outside. It comes from knowing exactly where they stand with themselves. That's the difference. Confidence isn't needing everyone to see you a certain way. It's not needing to control how you're seen at all. Think about it. The person who's always trying to sound confident rarely is. You can feel the effort, the over-explaining, the over-talking, the need to fill silence. But the person who is actually grounded doesn't rush. They don't force reactions. They don't try to win every interaction. They don't need to prove anything in real time. They speak when it matters. They stay quiet when it doesn't. They move with intention, not urgency. And because of that, people trust them more. Not because they're perfect, because they're stable. There's no tension in how they show up. No constant adjustment. No subtle need for validation. Just clarity. And that clarity creates something powerful, presence. The kind that doesn't demand attention, but holds it. Because when you're not focused on how you're being perceived, you're fully present in what you're doing. And people feel that. They don't analyze it. They don't label it. But they notice it. Because it's rare. In a world where most people are performing, you're not. And that alone makes you stand out without trying. Breaking the pattern in real time. This doesn't change overnight. Because this pattern is deep. It's been running for years. Every time you adjusted your words, every time you replayed a moment, every time you chose perception over truth, you reinforced it. So breaking it isn't about a single decision. It's about interrupting it, again and again, in real time. Start here. The next time you catch yourself thinking, how did that sound? What do they think of me? Did I mess that up? Pause. Don't answer the question. Notice it. That's the pattern trying to pull you back in. That's the habit of performing. And the moment you notice it, you've already created space. Now, redirect. Instead of asking how you're being seen, ask something simpler. Was I clear? Was I honest? Did I act in line with who I am? That's it. Not perfect, not impressive. Aligned. Because alignment doesn't need approval. Then practice restraint. When you feel the urge to explain more than necessary, stop. When you feel the need to justify your decision, don't. When you want to correct how you were perceived, let it go. This is where the real shift happens. Not in what you say, but in what you stop doing. You stop chasing clarity in other people's minds and start building it in your own. You'll feel the discomfort at first, that silence after you don't over-explain, that moment where you don't correct the narrative, that gap where you don't fill the space. It will feel like something is missing, because you're used to controlling the outcome. But stay there. That discomfort is where freedom begins. Because the more you resist the urge to perform, the less control it has over you. And slowly, the pattern weakens. You stop replaying every interaction. You stop analyzing every detail. You stop adjusting every part of yourself in real time. Not because you don't care anymore, because you're no longer dependent on being seen a certain way. And that changes how you move through everything. Less noise, less tension, more clarity. Because for the first time, you're not splitting your attention between you and the audience. You're fully here, with yourself, and that's where real control lives. The man who stops performing, at some point, it clicks, not in a loud, dramatic way, quietly. You notice you're not replaying things as much. You're not analyzing every interaction. You're not adjusting yourself mid-conversation. The same situations still happen. People still react in their own ways. Moments still feel uncertain. Not everything lands perfectly. But you're not pulled into it anymore. There's space now, between what happens and how you experience it. And in that space, there's something you didn't have before. Freedom. You're no longer trying to manage how you're perceived. You're not chasing approval. Not correcting every impression. Not carrying conversations long after they end. You just show up. Clear. Direct. Unedited. And because of that, you feel lighter. Not because life got easier, because you stopped adding unnecessary weight to it. You're not running background calculations anymore. You're not splitting your attention between you and everyone else. You're just present, and that changes everything. You speak without hesitation. You move without overthinking. You leave moments where they belong, in the past. And something interesting happens. People respond differently. Not because you're trying harder, because you're not trying at all. There's no tension in how you show up. No need to impress. No subtle pressure to be understood. And that makes you easier to trust. Easier to be around. Because you're not asking anything from the interaction. You're not performing for it. This is what most people are missing. They think confidence is something you add. But it's not. It's what remains. When you stop performing, when you stop filtering every word, when you stop managing every impression, when you stop living through other people's eyes, what's left is you. And that version is more stable, more grounded, more real than anything you were trying to construct before. So don't try to become more impressive. Become more aligned. One moment at a time. One decision at a time. One interaction where you choose clarity over performance. Because the more you do that, the more this becomes your default. Until one day, you realize something simple. You're no longer asking, "How am I being seen?" You're asking, "Am I being real?" And that's the shift. From performing to living. If you're ready to step into that version of yourself, type "I move real" in the comments. And if you want more of this, subscribe. Because this isn't about becoming someone new. It's about finally becoming yourself.